Hello, friends. I'm Mike Ongstad with Renew American Movement, Communications Director here. I am joined by Mr. Joel Searby, our National Political Director. And thank you for tuning in. As you are probably aware, the nation has been gripped watching a contest where a bunch of people were winnowed down just over time until we only had two people left fighting to win. And want to go ahead and congratulate the Atlanta Braves on finally taking that championship. But there was also another big contest that you might have heard about here in the state where I live, Virginia, as well as contest in New Jersey for the governors of those states. So we thought, we would take this time and do a quick kind of recap what we saw here from Renew America Movement in those races, prognosticate a little bit, but also not get ahead of ourselves in preaching that the future is set based on two short races. So with that, I just want to hand it over to Joel. If you have any initial thoughts on what we saw last night in New Jersey and and specifically in Virginia.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for tuning in. One of the things we definitely want to do here at Renew America is just have conversations about a little bit different perspective on these races, which is, we're a group of we'll call us center right and conservative and moderate Republicans, former Republicans, newly independent folks who are trying to specifically carve out this new coalition and this new way in politics. And honestly, our voices are not necessarily the most prominent voices on Twitter and cable news. So hopefully we can have this little spot of the internet here to talk about things like the races and the way we see them. My first thought, Mike, is one that I think is important for all of us to remember, which is not to overreact and try to over amplify the results of any single election in any single state. Of course, each of these states has their own unique dynamics. I think to use Virginia as an example, it appears pretty obvious to me that the matters around education, around parents' roles in education, around what is taught, around masks, around vaccine mandates, were a unique flavor in Virginia that was not as present in New Jersey, though not that it was not there at all, but those are not going to be the same discussions that happen in every state around the country and every single race in the country. So we have to understand what's going on in each individual race first and foremost. But I'll tell you my top level thought here I should have started with this probably, is that we should learn to listen to the voters and give them some credit that voters and Americans in general actually are pretty great folks. They are actually civically engaged and they're capable of making nuanced decisions. And so give you a couple of examples. I mean, to take Virginia, which everyone thought, oh, Biden won Virginia, it's moving blue, McAuliffe's been a governor. Here comes all the Democrats behind McAuliffe. And yet they elected a Republican governor. I think we should at least consider the possibility that a lot of those folks that voted for Joe Biden because they wanted perhaps to move past the Trump era also had the mental capacity to say, you know what, I'm not sure I want a Democratic governor. I think I kind of like this Youngkin guy and I'd like to give him a shot. And so we shouldn't assume that every voter thinks in sharp binaries like the Twitter sphere does. And I think that's my biggest takeaway. And I've got a few examples of that we can talk about, Mike, but I think I'll pause there and see if you got any reactions on that.
Yeah, Joel, I'm going to throw out a cliche that you no doubt have heard and probably uttered many a time to candidates you have advised, and that is all politics is local.
Right.
It's a cliche, but it is true. It's what people care about. And for me, being a Virginia resident, living in Northern Virginia, I have been treated to all of the ads that both candidates have put forth. And even beyond that, I've seen Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears and Attorney General Miaris, their ads as well as Herring and Ayala's. So I've seen what they're talking about and what they were talking about leading up to the election. And, it started off as, I'm Glenn Youngkin, I play basketball, I ran a business, I'm a nice guy. And towards the end, it really started to take focus and shape around schools, and specifically up here in Northern Virginia in Loudoun County, where there were a couple of different stories about either school boards having, parents being outraged at school boards and school boards, perhaps lying to them about sexual assault case. There's raised questions about, is the school safe, or the school board really doing anything? And McAuliffe stepped in it during the second debate by saying, I don't think parents should be telling schools what to teach. We can debate the factual accuracy of that kind of a statement, how much parents should be deciding what exactly schools teach and how they do that. In my thinking, it's typically through electing the school board, but whatever. That became a big catalyzing issue, and it broke itself into two forms. One was, are schools safe? And so you saw, especially, I think, Miaris trying to hit the incumbent Attorney General, Mark Herring, over a couple of instances of violence in schools in Northern Virginia, and explicitly Northern Virginia. I'm somewhat curious whether or not that messaging was amplified to Southern Virginia or not, or if that was strictly kind of to approach the suburbs of DC up here in Northern Virginia. But you had that, and then you also had this question of content. It became CRT, critical race theory, and he even filmed an ad with a Republican operative saying that her son had nightmares from reading a book that she wanted him to be able to opt out of, and it became a big drama. Turned out the book was actually Toni Morrison's Beloved, and he was a senior in an AP English class, and the story wasn't quite what was made out to be, but it ultimately ended up being this flashpoint again, CRT, books about LGBTQ issues in schools, and then violence in schools. And to me, those were the main focus for the Republicans. And what I want to kind of push back to you, Joel, here is on the Democratic side. So much of what I saw in the advertising was talking about January 6th. It was talking about Donald Trump, Glenn Youngkin as Trump's candidate. Clips of Youngkin even saying in the campaign, Trump is one of the main reasons I'm running. And so, the question is, obviously their strategy was to message explicitly, at least in Northern Virginia, Trump, 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 January 6th, January 6th, January 6th. And so I guess the question to divine out of this is it possible to saddle the party with Trump and Trumpism as a winning strategy? Or does that fall short for a lot of voters?
Well, I think it's an important question as we go into this cycle. I think what the Democrats and quite honestly groups like ourselves, who many of us are very motivated by the issues surrounding January 6th and Trump and Trumpism. The question really is not just how do we feel personally about that, but how do the voters who are deciding these races really process that as a part of their bigger decision? And back to my original point, I think we don't give voters enough credit. We think that voters are more easily motivated by fear and binaries. And I think, unfortunately, that is being driven by the system, which is set up that way, and by the parties who believe that is also the best way to achieve their goals. But what we know for a fact, because the electoral results have borne it out, is that voters they are able to do nuance. They can say Trump bad, Youngkin good. They're able to do that. And a couple of examples that I mentioned earlier. So in New Jersey, which again is relevant to today's conversation, in 2020, one of our renewers, Andy Kim, a Democrat, won in the New Jersey 3rd Congressional District by 8 points, and Trump won that district. So here was a Democrat who was a reasonable guy, a great patriot, great public service, Democrat, wins in a district that Trump also won. Trump narrowly won it. Another example would be the New York 24. So Republican, so there's a Democrat that won in New Jersey. In New York 24, Republican John Katko. He won by 10 points against his Democratic opponent. Biden won that particular district by 9. So a 20-point difference almost between Katko's results and Biden's results. Again, a perfect example of, even in a highly polarized situation like 2020, voters will go both ways. Another kind of more holistic example, and perhaps one of the biggest flashpoints, is Georgia. Georgia, of course, was the center of a lot of the big lie narrative. But even though Biden ended up winning by 12,000 votes, one of the things that, for example, Lieutenant Governor Duncan, who we had on our RAM chat, was saying that people just were not understanding is that the Republicans did extremely well statewide. And so the whole idea that the vote was rigged, it was nonsensical. What the real answer is that voters can make nuanced decisions. A lot of voters in Georgia said, I would like to have a Republican legislature, but I really don't like Donald Trump. And so that's what happened there. I think that's what's happening in Virginia. I think that's what's happening in New Jersey as well in the governor's race there, that, perhaps more dramatically, although I think we should really be careful, day after there's a lot of mail-in ballots yet to come in. Democrats are much more likely to vote mail-in. So that one could end up still landing in the Democratic side. But anyways, the bigger point here being, again, there's good examples, good reasons why people make nuance. And so to get back to your question, Mike, to simply make everything about Trump and January 6th, as a blanket statement, I think is a really flawed approach. There are going to be places where that matters a lot. For example, in a congressional race where perhaps the opponent, let's just take Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, was at the center of the January 6th narrative, that might be a little different race. But in the case of Glenn Youngkin, I think perhaps the Democrats overreached in trying to make it all about Trump, and voters were wise to it.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I just build on that because you're right. There are people out there, you can see most of them featured exclusively on our dividers list, who have made themselves willfully on their part poster children for January 6th and for Trumpism writ large, and those are going to be attacks that I think are effective against them. But to your point about voters being able to see nuance and to think for themselves, is a very important one. I'd also add, kind of a corollary to that, which is that some things just don't pass the sniff test with voters. And I do think that Democrats could have done a better job of kind of tying Youngkin to Trump and Trumpism in a less kind of confrontational shoehorn sort of way, but in like, hey, who is this guy really kind of approach? Because he was up in Northern Virginia distancing himself from Trump, and down in Southern Virginia saying, I'm running because of Trump. So I think there was room for that kind of like, who is this guy really narrative, but they tried to go full steam into it. But the other side of that was, to try and paint him and tie him to Charlottesville and to racist violence in America, and specifically in Virginia. And I think, that there was just kind of an optics situation where voters are sitting here watching these ads and or publicity stunts by certain other groups, just like, we're like, oh, this guy is part of the Charlottesville white supremacist movement. And then you look at Youngkin and you're like, no, that doesn't fly, doesn't pass muster. And so ultimately, I actually think that those hurt Democrats, those kind of ads and that approach hurt Democrats by making Youngkin out almost to be a victim, and people who might see themselves a little bit in Glenn Youngkin, wanting to identify more with him.
Yeah, well, Mike, I'd be interested in your thoughts. I think we should talk about, our peers and, so to speak, our colleagues out there in this kind of former Republican center-right space. I'm not afraid to talk about them, by name if we need to, at Lincoln Project and others. Again, many of my friends and colleagues are involved in that. I think the question should become, how effective is it for folks who maybe are Republicans or former Republicans who don't agree with the president or are radically anti-Trump? Is it really effective to just go in and use the same tactics to the opposite extreme and burn the house down? Our take would be that that's not always the right approach, and maybe never the right approach. But instead, how do we find constructive ways to talk to Republicans and former Republicans who are very concerned about January 6th, about Trumpism, but again, are nuanced and smart enough to know that, as you pointed out, Glenn Youngkin is not a flaming racist. And so when you say things like that, you're scoring some nice Twitter points, but what are you doing to the election itself? And I think that's going to be one of the important postmortems there, and also informs, quite honestly, for those who are watching and wondering what Renew America is up to, informs why we're doing things differently, which is to really build grassroots networks of real live Republicans and conservatives and center-right independents who are going to go in and say, this is why in X case we need to support this Democrat, or in this other case we need to support this Republican, and really build a new consensus and coalition approach to governing, as opposed to just burning everything down.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand, there's a kind of shades of the Never Trump, for lack of a better moniker, group, right? You've got people who feel, I think, so burned by the Republican Party and what they became through Trumpism that if they ever come back to Republican politics, it will be a long time. And then you've got people who just want to get back to kind of republicanism that they found comfortable. And those are people who I think are eager to vote for a Republican when they don't cross this threshold into kind of the unacceptable territory. So to your point, our movement, we've got to coalesce people together and move those groups, plus moderate Democrats who may live in places where they are basically could be a deciding factor in which kind of Republican they get, rather than having a hope of electing a Democrat, and move them towards, move this coalition towards good people and bad people. I mean, I'll say, as I said, I'm a Virginian. I'm a lifelong Republican. Some days I don't claim that moniker anymore. Some days I do. It depends. But I did not vote for Glenn Youngkin or any of the other down ballot Republicans. And I'll say that the reason is this: I wasn't persuaded that Glenn Youngkin was a bad guy. He looked exactly like a more moderate Republican of old. But I found his Northern Virginia moderate, Southern Virginia Trumper shtick made me wonder, can I really trust this guy to be in charge of 2024? If Trump runs and Trump loses Virginia and it's close, and Donald Trump calls and the state legislature, which is another big thing that flipped in Virginia to Republican control, and they start calling the governor's office and they say, you need to find votes. Will he stand up? I sure hope he will. But to me, that was just kind of a trust issue. Mm-hmm. I don't like that he waded into the culture war stuff as much as he did. I feel like that's become just kind of part and parcel of Republican politics these days, unfortunately. But I also don't think every issue that he brought up in the campaign was a lie or was wrong. I think there are questions for kind of how we address in school, how school boards respond to parents, what is the role of parents in deciding their education, and how is racism discussed as an academic subject, especially in schools, that doesn't whitewash that history, but also isn't, kind of just rote indoctrination. So, all that is to say, I think I was the perfect target for what Youngkin wanted to grab, and I can understand the appeal. For me, it just came down to kind of that the single most important single issue voter here, and that is, will our next election be not secure, because they love using that. Trump loves using that term. Will the results be respected and honored and certified?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting angle you take there, Mike, which is different people have different core issues that they're looking to decide their vote on. And I think, again, we should not, as those of us who are working in the political space, should never assume that if we can just push forward one big message, then that works for everybody. Because again, voters need to hear that we're listening, that we understand what they are concerned about, and that there's nuance to that. And so, I think it's important. One lesson that I think everybody should take away from last night is that not only that all politics is local and all that kind of stuff, but that real connection to the issues of the day is still incredibly important. And I personally think the Democrats were incredibly tone deaf in how they approached the McAuliffe race. I think it was a really bad idea for them to trot out every Democrat that has been elected at a high office or been a superstar in the last 2 cycles, because what it made it feel like to, I think, a lot of those swing voters that ended up pushing Youngkin over the top in a big way was, oh, you are really just going to continue everything that the Democrats have been doing. And I'm not on board with that. And so I think they really missed the boat there. If I were them, and again, Monday morning quarterback, but more thinking now forward to how we may engage in races. If you know that you've got a central part of your electorate that is thinking in the kind of these moderate, new way forward, looking to build trust ways, those are the kinds of people that I would have been having speak for McAuliffe, as opposed to kind of the most polarizing figures. I mean, the only person they didn't bring was Nancy Pelosi. They might as well gone ahead and brought her. All the boogeymen, all the Democratic boogeymen were there, and I think that we should just take some lessons from that.
Yeah, there's almost a feeling, and Virginia really encapsulated that, which is that the Democrats are living off of the legacy of Barack Obama. They're hoping to just hold on a little bit longer to his coattails. I mean, he won in Virginia. McAuliffe is an Obama guy, and then they brought in Obama, who I still think is a very effective messenger for Democrats. I'm not trying to say that they shouldn't tie into him, but it's just what's new? Who's the new person, right? What do they have to offer? And Biden, I think, again, like I was saying about Youngkin and not passing the smell test and the attacks on him, Republicans went, Joe Biden's a radical leftist socialist, and every voter just went, what? We've known this guy 40 years. Come on. So, but Biden represented that constancy and that transition from the Obama administration. But where do Democrats go next? It's just kind of one of the kind of thoughts I had in watching all of this is it just felt stale and old. And in some ways, I think that's what they wanted, because McAuliffe was a safe political candidate, and they thought safe would win, and it didn't. I want to talk to you about something quickly, though. I want to make sure we get to this, and I unfortunately don't have a map to put up, but I've seen a lot of good maps on Twitter from like UVA Center for Politics has done some great work on this. Shout out to them; they're always great follows. But if you look at kind of the shift in voter attitudes in Virginia, one of the striking things that I think Kyle Klondike pointed out this morning is Western Virginia, which is, where West is, but really southwestern Virginia, the tail of the turkey on its back, if you are familiar with that analogy here. But it shifted really heavily red. Now that is solid Trump territory, always has been. But it got redder under Youngkin in this election. And it really kind of opened my eyes of, are Democrats trying to reach rural voters out there? Because in a statewide election, you can't just lock up your cities and then allow the Republicans to run up the the rural part of the state. And vice versa. Republicans can't afford to just count on the rural and make no play at the urban. So I was curious your thoughts. We look especially at statewide strategies, or even in districts that cover large swaths of territory. How do Democrats make inroads into those urban communities so that they're not just surrendering these votes essentially?
Yeah, no, great question. And before I move, if you're watching online now, feel free to drop some comments. We'll answer questions here at the end. We've got a few more minutes left, and make sure you follow and subscribe so you can stay up on our next conversations. I think, Mike, this is an interesting perspective coming from a guy who was a Republican operative for 11 years. And what we always did was we ran the numbers, right? We ran the numbers and we said, where do we need to get votes? And you add them all up, and that's where you focus your resources, where you need to add the most and where you can go get the most. I think that this was perhaps good data management, but I think in the inverse, the Democrats have been doing the same things in their urban numbers, and what that's ended up doing is contributing, I think, to this underlying problem that we see in polarization, which is, folks in the rural areas, and we've heard ad nauseum about this research, they felt like nobody was listening, nobody cared, nobody ever came and talked to them. That was true because Democrats didn't spend any time talking to those folks, even though they probably had a lot of good listening ears, whether it be on issues of labor or wages or the economy as a whole. But they just didn't even bother. Conversely, Republicans did the same with urban areas. I was in, I can't tell you how many meetings with high-level Republican operatives where some version of a phrase went about like this: don't even bother in those precincts. Those are all the fill in the blank voters. We'll never get them. Except the problem with that logic is that particularly on statewide races and or races where you have to add up all the votes, you're not trying to win one precinct, you're trying to win the whole state, or you're trying to win the whole district. There are net votes to be had in those places. And so by ignoring them, you are not only helping to further the divide. Again, I get it. That's why political operatives do what they do. But a group like ours, I think, has an opportunity to go in and talk to people who are feeling that way, that actually if someone would just talk to them and give them some reasons why they need to engage on this particular election, they would. And so part of the takeaway for me is, as you pointed out in Virginia, had McAuliffe spent more time, or his surrogates working on those folks, would it have made the difference in this race? Unlikely. However, you've got to think about the long game. And I think that's an important part of that. Now, how would you do it? You got to have surrogates. You got to have people who are from those areas. And that's really a core part of our strategy in particularly our House races, is to bring in credible spokespeople from within those communities who are then going to say, this is why we need to support this renewer or oppose this divider. And that's very different from, maybe they'll catch an ad on Fox News or CNN. We're talking about real, do the work in these districts, in these areas kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I want to elevate a little bit above the strategy and into the philosophy too. We talk a lot here at RAM about unifying leaders. And typically when we're talking about that, we're using it as a contrast to the dividers that we have, people who are actively trying to divide Americans against each other, who are sowing conspiracy theories, et cetera, et cetera. But there's something more proactive about being a unifying leader than just being not a divider, right? And I like to think that our renewers kind of meet that threshold. But I think this is part of it. If you want to be governor for an entire state, for example, to be a unifying leader, you've got to try in those communities, right? You can't just write off part of the state. It's both, I think, politically foolish, as you've just discussed, but it's also, I think, philosophically wrong. That's Southwest Virginia is not terribly populous, but it's an important part of the state. And so, to run a campaign, and we're not in the room when Democratic strategists are doing this stuff, and they didn't come asking us, but so we don't know exactly what happened. But if you're just writing off a significant swath of the state because, well, that's not our territory, well, you need to, even if it seems politically like it may not be the biggest payoff, I still think you need to be that unifying leader. You need to make outreach. You need to make an attempt.
Mm-hmm. Well, and people, I think, again, operatives especially tend to think in terms of numbers of voters, and really forget to think about all the intangibles that actually win elections. And we've been through an era in politics of advancing the technology, whether it be data and targeting, or whether it be use of other technologies. And I think, unfortunately, and I'll say particularly on the Democratic side, it's almost become technocratic as opposed to the relational kinds of politics that, honestly, Donald Trump really honed in on in a big way. He made it all about himself and his personality. Again, people know where I stand on that. Not a fan of that. However, I think operatives and those who are involved locally, whether you're a grassroots leader or just running for local office, should not forget that all of these activities that Mike's talking about, reaching into communities that maybe no one ever shows up in, these have what I call knock-on effects that have a dramatic impact on the bigger picture. And I'll just point to one. I heard an interview with a rural Virginia voter, and here's what he said. I have never in my life, he was at least in his 60s, maybe his 70s. I've never in my life had a gubernatorial candidate come to our town. And that meant so much to that voter. And it was, in this case, it was Youngkin. His tour stopped there. They didn't spend a lot of time, but they were there. And that in and of itself, I heard that on a national news outlet, right? So the campaign, might have thought, well, why would we stop in that town? There's like 600 people there. But what ended up happening was this knock-on effect of this older guy who was not a radical Trumper. He was just like a farmer who was trying to, make his way forward and figure out who he's going to vote for. And he met Glenn Youngkin, and that had this knock-on effect that created a national story in this particular case because there was press with him and all of the things that happened because they made a decision to go to this place where people generally were not going to go. So I think these are lessons to take away from races like this is, we can't win elections, Democrats, Republicans, independents, or otherwise, solely on the strength of having all the best technology and data and even money. We still have to do the important work of politics, which ultimately is building relationships.
Yeah. And for people that don't know, watching, Joel and I first met each other on the Evan McMullin campaign in 2016. And we did a rather fun road trip from the north of the state down to the south, south of the state, stopping in a lot of those towns that probably get overlooked. Little diners with 30, 40 people, and some of the most fun I had on that campaign doing that. So also a big plug for the campaign staff and for the candidates. Those can be fun. Those are great. You get to have actual one-on-one time with people. That's great. So we're kind of coming up on time. We've discussed a lot of great things here with respect to Virginia and some in New Jersey. I just want to give you a chance, put you on the spot for, I think, what is probably the hardest question. And that is education, critical race theory, parental control, mask mandates. Schools are shaped up in Virginia, and I think will shape up over the next year to be one of the number one issues in America. And there's a lot of frustration due to being remote school for a long time. How do we keep schools safe? What's being taught? What would be your advice to a renewer candidate when this subject of parental rights, education, school, teaching of racial history, racist history in America, that kind of thing? How do you address that so that it doesn't become the biggest bludgeon that the Republican Party has in elections?
Well, I think first and foremost, if you're a candidate for public office, one of the most important things you need to be doing is listening. You need to be truly listening to what people are saying in your district, those people whom you will represent, and not walking into a room assuming that all they want to hear is your stump speech and your positions on every issue. Now, you'll probably get there. They're going to ask those questions, and you should have good answers about how you feel about those things. But the first thing you need to do is listen. And that's going to help you understand not only how you answer and respond, but could inform the way you actually think about the issue if you're truly believing that you're a representative of the people. Not suggesting that you should, flip-flop on issues if you're on the other side of the issue from somebody you're talking to, but you need to listen, number one. I think the second thing is when we talk about taking a measured approach, I don't think we should equate that with being a weak approach, and it should also not confuse kindness for weakness. And so I think we can say, let's just use the mask mandate, for example. I'm a parent. I have two kids in schools. Our schools are still under mask mandate. And there's been vitriolic fights over it, trying to remove people from the school board. We've experienced it as well. I think we should be sensitive to the fact that there are more than one approach to thinking about every important issue. And I was just talking to a Democratic operative friend who said, I think people are responding in kind of the middle and certainly on the right to this idea that Democrats, for example, will demonize you if you are anywhere other than the place that they want you to be on a given issue, whether that's masks or vaccines or race. And so I think the extreme left and the extreme right have created this position where you're demonized if you don't fit into the right spot. And so one of the first things you can do dealing with these issues is to say, listen, we may not agree on this issue. I'll let you know where I stand on this issue, but I just want you to know that I want to have an open dialogue. And you can say that to one person, you can say that to a room of 150 people. And it sets you in a position that says, I believe certain things and I have principles and I actually do have positions. But what I'm not going to do is cancel you and dismiss you. Of course, the right and the left have become really experts at canceling. But rejecting that in your own personal campaigning, I think is a really critical element in tackling these really tough issues.
I think that's great. And it gets right back to where we started this entire conversation with, which is voters are capable of nuance, so if you don't offer it to them, they don't have anything to take away from you, right? So I love that. Let's trust voters. I do want to just wrap up, just say, first of all, great job by Virginia in holding this election, tabulating it, counting it. It's gone off without a hitch. And obviously, just as we've known, no massive fraud. The results are the results. We can accept them. We can move on. We all have an obligation to dispel those kinds of conspiracy theories, but huge turnout in Virginia in an off-year election, which is so unusual. And it's just fantastic. Win or lose, your side. Fantastic to see that many Americans engaged civically and politically. So just fantastic to see that. Makes my heart swell with a little pride as a Virginian here. But friends, thank you for joining us. Do go ahead and subscribe on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter at Renew America, and find us on Facebook, Renew America Movement. Keep in touch. Sign up for our emails at our website, renewamerica.com. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, or just something you want to get off your chest. We appreciate it.